Israel. So this is an important military facility, and it's also the location of Natanz, which is the place where nuclear weapon development is being conducted by the Iranians. In addition to Isfahan, Tehran, Fordo, Iraq, Natanz, Karg Island, Bushehr, and Badr Abbas may have also come under attack. So this is a robust attack, but at the same time limited in that some targets were hit, but it does not appear that there was major damage done at any of these locations. It's more symbolic, showing that the Israelis could do this, as opposed to trying to bring a lot of pain to Iran.
And Mr. Ken, this breaking news coming into our live now from Fox Studios from an unnamed U.S. official. We are still awaiting to see if Israel does take ownership of their alleged retaliatory strike on Iran. I want to ask you the implications if they did in fact do this, because we know that several of their
The IMF has sounded an alarm about the risks posed by the booming private credit sector, commonly referred to as shadow banks, with $2.1 trillion involved. These lenders provide quick, flexible, and confidential borrowing options to companies, considered too risky for traditional banks. However, lax regulation coupled with the potential for economic downturns could lead to severe consequences, including defaults and significant losses. The IMF warns that the interconnectedness and opacity of these deals could amplify risks across the broader financial system. While immediate risks seem limited, the IMF urges regulators to adopt a proactive approach to oversee this sector. Additionally, the IMF cautions the Bank of England against leaving interest rates too high for too long, especially considering the large share of UK homeowners with fixed-rate mortgages, which could lead to a sudden drop in consumer spending and potentially trigger financial instability.
Jemana, what do we know then at this point about the strike?
Yeah, good morning, Tom. Well, ever since Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel last weekend, there's been rampant speculation as to how Israel were looking to respond. And indeed, it seems like the response has come overnight. Now, explosions were heard around Iran's third largest city, Isfahan, very early in the morning. Shortly afterwards, U.S. officials confirmed that indeed Israel had launched an attack on Isfahan. Details are still fuzzy at this point, but what we do understand is that the target of this specific attack was the airbase in Isfahan, which actually was the same airbase that Iran used to launch those drones and those missiles that they used last weekend for their attack on Israel. Now, at this point, what we are hearing from Iranian state officials is that they are downplaying the extent of this attack. They were very quick to say that none of their nuclear facilities had been targeted. There was no harm there. And that, of course, caused a bit of a turnaround in market because initially there was some concern that Israel were going to go after those nuclear facilities. And they're recently just saying moments ago, Iranian local media Tasnim has also said that there are no reports of an attack from abroad on Iran's central city of Isfahan or any part of the country, and that Iran's own air defense system was the source of all of that noises. So again, details are very fuzzy at this point, but analysts are quick to point out that if this is indeed the Israel response to those unprecedented Iranian attacks on Israel last weekend, then they are deemed to be quite limited and proportionate in nature. But of course, it is up to the Iranians at this point on how they will choose to respond.
Yeah, and give us a little bit more detail then, Jemana, in terms of that potential Iranian response and the implications.
Yes, so the Iranian state media have actually denied that a Security Council meeting is taking place at this point. So we haven't had anything from Iranian leadership. All that we can parse together is what we're hearing from Iranian state media. And as I just said earlier, they have been denying reports of extensive damage within the country. But what we do know is that Israel themselves are preparing themselves for a possible retaliation. We know that the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem staff there have been warned about the possibility of a retaliation as well. But again, as you were just referring to, because this at this point appears to be a very limited strike on one specific military base, perhaps it could be deemed insufficient enough to worry a significant response from Iran. The background, of course, yesterday, the Iranian foreign minister was speaking at the Security Council, and he warned Israel against further adventurism. Whether or not this qualifies as adventurism, again, remains to be seen. It is a fast-moving story.
Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel made the new reality of conflict very clear. From Iran to Ukraine, this is the era of cheap drone warfare.
Kyiv endured an aerial assault by Russian drones.
The Kremlin seeing the biggest drone attack yet inside Russia.
Missiles, drones, a barrage of attacks in the Red Sea.
Iran has started a direct attack on Israel by launching dozens of drones.
Drones have changed the landscape of war.
It's like the AK-47 of 21st century warfare.
They're a feature of the modern battlefield, mostly because they're so inexpensive and easy to make. And many of these drones can be traced back to Iran, a country under strict international sanctions. So how are drones changing the economics of warfare?
This attack was a direct response to something that happened on the 1st of April when Israel bombed a building close to the Iranian embassy in Damascus. There were some very senior Iranian generals in that building who died in that attack.
The Iranians had to respond.
These were designed to overwhelm Israeli defenses while a separate battery of missiles were following at the distance. So if everything had gone to plan, the missiles would have been able to penetrate those defenses. We've never seen a swarm this big. Scores all set off at the same time, and it could be a game changer in the way war is conducted.
A asymmetry is often what decides a conflict. That's effectively when one side is more powerful than the other.
Historically, at least in the modern history of warfare, every technological advance has come from the technologically superior military power. So the most powerful countries got more powerful, and the gap between them and the rest widened.
To address this kind of mismatch, the weaker power seeks a way to catch up, an asymmetrical tool.
Drone warfare is a way to close the capability gap, and it's a way to diffuse power.
Drones come in a full spectrum.
Most of the drones that we're using in the West, like the Reaper drone, which has been somewhat the iconic drone that we've used since 9/11, which cost in the region of $30 million.
At the other end of the spectrum are the drones we saw over the weekend. They are what are called kamikaze drones. All they do is carry a payload of explosive, and they ram into a target and blow up. In military circles, they're called lawnmowers on wings.
People are saying that the Shahed drone is Iran's AK-47 because it is extremely versatile and can be produced in high quantity at low cost. Now we entered into the next phase of drone warfare, which is low-tech drones at large quantities.
The main Iranian drone company is called Shahed Aviation Industries, which the US says is a subsidiary of the Revolutionary Guards.
They have been using scores and scores of small companies to circumvent sanctions.
They have their own smuggling networks globally where they can get their hands on any sort of component part that they need.
Shahed drones can be found in Syria, Russia, Ethiopia, Tajikistan, and Venezuela. The Shahed 136 is the best known. It carries up to 50 kilograms of explosives and has a range of up to 2,500 kilometers, which lets Iran strike targets within Israel without needing to use proxy forces in Lebanon, Gaza, and elsewhere. This is where the economic consideration comes in.
They cost anywhere between $20,000 and $50,000.
Others are even cheaper, as little as $1,000.
Each missile the Israelis were using cost in the region of hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. America and Israel together probably spent around $1.5 billion in defending against the Shahed drones, while the Shahed drones all put together probably cost the Iranians in the region of something like $3 million. You can drain your enemy's military budgets by them having to restock their air defenses at a very high cost.
If Iran didn't have these drones and these missiles, it would have to send jet fighters over long distances in order to attack Israel. If Israel shot down those jet fighters, that would be a huge blow for Iran.
Iran's proxy in Yemen, the Houthis, have already managed to clog up trade in the Red Sea with the threat of drones and inexpensive but accurate missiles. Drones have changed the war in Ukraine too. Cheap, consumer, mainly Chinese models have been adapted to drop explosives on multi-million-dollar tanks, and more sophisticated drones have been used to great effect against the Russian Navy.
Those drones have been key in Ukraine's ability to destroy quite a large part of Russia's naval fleet in the Black Sea.
The US military has leaned increasingly on fewer but more sophisticated and more expensive weapons systems. All of this is provoking big rethinks about how to kit out modern armies.
Over time, we need to find a better way to defend against these drones at lower cost.
We know that the US has been developing weapons to counter the threat of drones. Lasers, the use of anti-aircraft weapons. The German anti-aircraft weapons have been very effective in Ukraine, for instance.
But there's a big economic challenge here too.
For defense industry, it's more profitable to rely on the multi-billion-dollar research and development of sophisticated platforms where you only sell one or two or three of.
In other words, big defense companies don't consider cheap drones an attractive business proposition. To change that thinking, governments would need to provide defense companies with the motivation to build the tech.
I think what is needed is an incentive and a push to say we need more platforms at cheaper cost and use them in a networked way.
answers, and they're often seen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're terrorists. They murder a lot of Americans, Israelis, Europeans, and Arabs as just an instrument of Iran. I'm not sure Iran's hold on Hezbollah is necessarily that iron tight, because the last full-scale Israeli Hezbollah war, 2006, was devastating for both Hezbollah and Lebanon. And now Hezbollah, unfortunately, has far more missiles and rockets and poses a huge, huge threat, unfortunately, to Israel. But the Israeli military is more powerful than ever. So if Hezbollah wasn't willing to step up, Iran might have felt it had to act on its own, and it was a complete dud. And for the first time in history, the Israeli military demonstrated, in fact, not in theory, that it can strike deep within Iranian territory, right by their nuclear sites, and also they could take out government sites if they needed to, too. So I think that Iran's acting out of weakness. And when we talk about regional war, thank God at this point, Iran sponsors a lot of murderous terrorism against Americans, Europeans, and Israelis, including October 7th, which was horrific. But as far as regional war, I don't really see how Iran can fight this regional war. They could cut off key waterways temporarily that would disrupt badly global oil, but that is
retaliating in very strong. Out of at the country's central Isfahan city, but the reason is unknown. Several Iranian nuclear sites are located in Isfahan province, including Natanz, the centerpiece of Iran's uranium enrichment program. On Thursday, a senior Iranian Revolutionary Guards commander said that Iran could review its nuclear doctrine following Israeli threats. The remarks raised concerns about Tehran's nuclear program, which it has always said was strictly for peaceful purposes. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has the last say on Tehran's nuclear program. And amid rising tensions, Ahmad Haqqallah, the Guards commander in charge of nuclear security, hit out at Tel Aviv. He said, and I'm quoting here, "If the Zionist regime wants to take action against our nuclear centers and facilities, we will reciprocate with advanced missiles against their own nuclear sites." Addressing officials from the Mossad and Shin Bet intelligence units on Thursday, Netanyahu stressed the need and importance of determination and unity. He said his country was committed to defeating the terrorist axis in Gaza, freeing the hostages, and repelling the overall threat coming from Iran. Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said Israel has the freedom of action to do what it wants.
המציאות הזאת שאנחנו מותקפים בה משבע זירות שונות.
Reported explosions in the Iranian regions of Isfahan and Tabriz. It comes amid spiraling geopolitical tensions in West Asia. West Asia in a war talks of
What do we know then at this point about the strike?
news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moscow. Iranian state media is confirming an attack by Israel, saying the sabotage operation involving drones had failed. Israel launched a retaliatory strike on Iran following last week's missile and drone barrage from Tehran, according to two U.S. officials, though media from both countries appear to downplay the severity of the incident. We get more with Bloomberg breaking news editor Dana Kreisch.
Reports initially from Iran suggested there was some sort of an attack as these reports started trickling in of a blast over Isfahan. This is Iran's third largest city, and it houses military sites and, of course, some of its nuclear infrastructure. What we know from Iranian media is that the defense systems were activated to intercept what local media said there were drones. And then hours later, they started downplaying this attack even further. Some even called them miniature drones. Maybe we wouldn't go that far, but we know that U.S. officials, of course, told Bloomberg that Israel had launched a retaliatory airstrike or strike against Iran.
That's Bloomberg's Dana Kreisch. The Israeli government, which rarely comments on specific military actions linked to Iran, has not confirmed the strike. Group of 7 foreign ministers are warning of new sanctions against Iran for its drone and missile attack on Israel and urged both sides to avoid an escalation of the conflict. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke this morning.
We're committed to Israel's security. We're also committed to de-escalating, to trying to bring this tension to a close.
And that's Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Meanwhile, the U.S. could send more arms to Israel. According to the Wall Street Journal, the White House is considering more than $1 billion in new weapons deals for Israel, including tank ammunition, military vehicles, and mortar rounds. The proposed arms transfers would be in addition to the military aid deal currently before Congress. Well, the jury has been seated for Donald Trump's criminal trial in Manhattan. Bloomberg's Amy Morris reports.
It has been a painstaking process, but all 12 jurors and one alternate are seated. As court prepared to adjourn, Judge Juan Merchan worked out the schedule for Monday and Tuesday during the Jewish holiday of Passover, saying that they'll adjourn at 2 p.m. on those days so people can attend Seders. Now, as for today, they still have to seat 5 more alternates, so 100 jurors will return to be questioned to fill those slots. Judge Merchan says he's optimistic they can wrap up this phase by the end of today. Also, prosecutors asked for Trump to be held in contempt over a series of social media posts this week, something the judge says he'll take up in court on Tuesday. Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Amy, thank you. In India, millions are voting in a 6-week election. That's a referendum on Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The first round of voting is being held across 21 states. Modi is seeking a third rare term in office. Let's turn to the markets now, where the latest earnings story centers on Netflix. Shares lower in early trading, subscriber growth for the streaming giant surpassing estimates, but the company said those gains will be lower this period. Bloomberg's Lucas Shaw in Los Angeles says optimism for Netflix's results had been very bullish.
Expectations for this company were really high. I mean, you saw a lot of analysts publishing optimistic notes leading up to it. The stock has been on a tear over the last few months. And so I think there was almost no way that it was going to live up to that. You know, you see the results. It basically doubled the subscriber estimates. That's pretty strong. So I'd say one is just expectations. And the other is maybe that there was some sensitivity around the forecast. You know, the revenue forecast is actually pretty strong. It's going to grow faster than it did in the first quarter. But it said its subscriber growth would tick down a bit in the second quarter.
And that's Bloomberg's Lucas Shaw, who says Netflix will stop reporting paid quarterly membership and revenue per subscriber beginning with the first quarter of next year. Procter & Gamble boosted its profit outlook as the maker of Pampers diapers and Dawn dish soap coupled steady price increases with easing commodity costs and productivity gains. While earnings in the quarter beat expectations, sales fell short. American Express reported revenue that topped estimates in the first 3 months of the year as consumers continued to flock to the company's premium credit card offerings. And Tesla recalling almost 3,900 Cybertruck pickups to rework or replace accelerator pedals that can dislodge and cause the vehicle to unintentionally accelerate, increasing risk of a crash. The company said that when high force is applied to the Cybertruck's accelerator, the pedal may dislodge and become trapped by interior trim. S&P futures lower, down 0.4%. Dow futures down 0.25%. NASDAQ futures down 0.6%. 10-year Treasury yield 4.58%. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moscow, and this is Bloomberg.
The countdown has begun. From May 14th to 16th, 1,000 global leaders will gather in Doha for the Qatar Economic Forum powered by Bloomberg. Join heads of state, influential ministers, and leading CEOs to make new connections, gain unique insights, and uncover valuable opportunities in one of the world's most rapidly rising regions. Request your invite for this exclusive event at QatarEconomicForum.com.
Order up.
Caribbean Kitchen, foods offer 70 ingredients. We serve ordinary cooking experience.
Taking the time to log in. So, hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. Don't know if you remember or not, but the last time when Iran launched its attack on Israel, what I told you, family, was that social media blew up like well before this thing was broadcast on or acknowledged by mainstream media. In other words, we got indications of the attack, via Twitter, via TikTok, way before mainstream media picked it up. So same thing here, family. So we were sitting over here minding our own business, and all of a sudden Twitter just starts blowing up, just all kinds of messages, reports of attacks. Folks have their phones, right, that may take them another hour or two before they acknowledged it. They may even wait until after the attack to to acknowledge this strike. So just an FYI, just in case you're in the background trying to Google this stuff. But here you go, family. So according to Iran's state media, they're acknowledging on their side that Israel attacked some of the sites in Iran, right? So just for the benefit of those that are dialing in, if you're wondering, who we believe that Iran is. Oh, actually, let me go through this first before I switch over to the browser, because it'll make it just a little bit easier. But let me share this with you, family. So this is just another video just showing the, Iran here is supposedly shooting down, drones or whatnot that are invading its airspace. And let me see if I can share this. I don't know if you'll be able to hear anything. Let's see. Yeah, there isn't much volume on this one, family. Just the context, what you see, the little explosions over the city of Iran. And then, let's see here. All right. Iran did say that if you strike our nuclear site, Israel, we will strike your nuclear site, which is right. Last time we talked about this was Jeremiah chapter 51. For her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies. Verse 10, and it says, where it says the Lord, we actually
attention
I'd like to get some cash out of my account.
You know what's messed up is this guy questioning stuff. He'll probably end up getting kicked out of the bank, maybe arrested by the police because he's causing a disturbance. You know?
Yeah.
Like they treat the customer like they're a disease.
He's like, I'm not leaving. No, sorry, you're not getting any cash today. Of course, the real reason she's asking that question is because she's trying to avoid at all costs having to admit the fact that they don't actually have cash in the bank anymore. It's gone. And of course, there's a multifaceted group of reasons as to why it's gone. Number one, they don't want bank runs on large number of people when they come into a bank who want cash, right? So they don't want bank runs. Like everyone's like, wait a second. I think I want to get my money out of this bank.
Right. Is this Greece? Come on.
Right. Well, remind our audience what happened in Greece.
Yes, Greece, the money was so deflated so quickly that you couldn't get any money out of an ATM more than once a day. Maximum amount was about, I don't know, $200 at the time. It's wild.
Yeah, and ridiculous.
This is in modern times, like within the last 5 years.
Right.
That this happened.
And of course, so they don't want these bank runs. They don't want a bunch of people rolling up to the ATMs trying to get money out of these banks. One way, of course, to eliminate bank runs is to eliminate cash. Totally. Which is what you're seeing. This week, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, put out an ominous warning that cyber attacks could destroy the banking industry and cause bank runs, meaning people run to the bank to try to take out their cash all at the same time, but the banks don't have your money in the first place, so they can't give you any money anyway. This isn't a conspiracy theory. What you're looking at here is the International Monetary Fund issuing this warning. The organization's latest global financial stability report warns that the size of extreme losses from cyber incidents has more than quadrupled since 2017 to a value of $2.5 billion. The report also claims the financial sector is uniquely exposed to cyber attacks. Well, it's a good thing we don't have any cyber attacks. Oh, wait a second. Widespread reports over the past 24 hours of entire 911 phone networks going down. Cyber attack on the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which brought down a bridge thanks to a barge hitting it. But yeah, we don't have any cyber attacks to worry about. So
which is currently being investigated by the FBI. You should say that so no one says, like, where'd you get that, Clayton? That's a conspiracy.
Yes, the FBI is currently investigating the Francis Scott Key Bridge 20 days after it struck the bridge and brought it down. Anyway,
I have a question really quick. So are they still, when they add to the monetary, like the money supply, are they still required to print what they're putting out, or are they just adding it in a computer? Because what I'm wondering is if there's actually a shortage on notes.
No.
You know?
It's a fraction of the actual money that's technically in supply, in circulation. The ones in, the digital version of the dollar, there's only a fraction of that actually. The IMF says their solution is an all-digital framework. Da-da-da, of course. Scare you, make you fear terrorism and cyber attacks, and move you to an all-digital framework with no cash whatsoever. Here's their report. Digitization means the more financial transactions and services are conducted online, it creates more entry points and vulnerabilities for hackers to exploit. Weak corporate governance of cybersecurity means that some financial firms may not invest enough in some cybersecurity and may not have adequate policies or procedures to prevent, detect, or respond to cyber attacks. So this move towards digital infrastructure means that we also need to have the cybersecurity back-end infrastructure. That's why you're seeing the rise of CISA in the United States, the cyber insecurity division within the United States.
Good morning, everyone.
My name is Julie Kozak. I'm the Director of Communications of the IMF. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Managing Director's press briefing on the global policy agenda. As usual, we will begin today with some opening remarks from our Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, and then we will move to your questions. So Kristalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julie. You are all familiar with this. We present at the spring and annual meetings our policy priorities, and this is what you would see out today. I would like to start by thanking all of you for the work you do, covering the stories that impact the world. And we all know over the last years there have been plenty of turbulence in the world economy for you to cover. We had a pandemic, wars, climate disasters, a cost of living crisis. But you also have the opportunity to cover remarkable resilience. As you saw from our World Economic Outlook on Tuesday, despite these multiple shocks and tight financial conditions, growth is firmly in positive territory, and we have slightly upgraded our forecast for this year to 3.2%. Yet, there is plenty to worry about. Inflation is down, but not gone. In the US, strong economic performance has a flip side. Disinflation is taking longer than expected. Medium-term growth prospects at around 3% are the lowest in decades, held back by a broad-based slowdown in productivity. And divergences within and across groups of countries are growing, with poorer countries falling even further behind. In this context, we have the meetings and we are presenting our global policy agenda, focusing on three priorities. First, rebuilding fiscal buffers. We have long advocated that while central banks pursue return of inflation to target, they can use some help from the fiscal side. Now, fiscal restraint is becoming even more important on its own right, because fiscal capacity is exhausted in most countries, and debt is dangerously up. Last year, global public debt edged up to 93% of GDP. This is some 9 percentage points above the pre-pandemic level. Debt service is also more expensive as interest rates have increased. In a world where crises keep coming, countries must urgently build fiscal resilience to be prepared for the next shock. As hard as it is, when still part of the population needs support and half of the world is going to the polls, the time has come to adopt medium-term frameworks for fiscal consolidation. We recognize one size does not fit all. The pace and speed of consolidation would vary depending on country circumstances. So will also the balance between mobilizing revenue and improving spending efficiency. What is very important is not to forget the burden should not fall on the most vulnerable people. The second priority, to revive growth prospects. Foundational reforms, strengthening governance, cutting red tape, increasing female labor market participation, improving access to capital. They're all essential for growth. And even more so, our productivity-enhancing structural reforms and investment in human capital, the green and the digital transition. With artificial intelligence already upon us, coordination on global rules is as important as having the technology and the skills to tap into it.
Really important. That's the one thing we cannot allow to get out of control. We have growth, yes, slower growth, but growth overall. And third, we have very high employment levels. If I think about Santander's Europe and America's footprint, every single one of our countries is at historically high levels of employment. So, this is not bad. If a year ago you had asked many people where are we going to be, anybody that said soft landing, you would say, oh, you're being too optimistic. We have a super soft landing so far. So far, so good.
The growth profile is certainly much better than we thought it would be, not just 12 months ago, but maybe even 3 months ago. Though we still have 2 wars, we also have increased protectionism. It's been a key feature of the meetings this week, as you well know. A backslide towards industrial policy in places like the United States. Can I ask you, as someone who leads a bank, does that make it more difficult to be an international bank against that backdrop?
The key thing we're all looking to, and this is not different from what everybody is saying, is that the most difficult and the key risks now are geopolitical. As I said, the macro looks much better, at least for now. So as we think about what is happening and what these geopolitics mean for supply chains, for our business, understanding that this is going to mean more structural inflation because, you're going to have higher cost. Understanding that you need to prioritize the defense or national security, or in the case of companies, diversification, which again is a key asset, at least for us, and this is really very valuable. So these are the things you need to think about. How do I protect my business at a time when the world is increasingly volatile, where you're having a big shift in terms of we want secure supply chain. Yes, we want it to be affordable, good prices, but security is paramount. And of course, we also want to ensure that we can manage the green and the climate transition.
If geopolitical risks are your number one concern and that could potentially mean a spike in inflation, do you expect the ECB to then, what's been pretty much forecasted by everyone, go ahead of the Fed and have this rate cut in June?
So, what we're all thinking about is what is the terminal rate? Where does this end up? That is the key question. And our view, and as an institution, is that that terminal rate is not going to be the same in Europe as in the US. It's probably be around, if you talk to most economists, 4% in the US, around 3% in Europe. What it means is that, let's say, rates will end up around those levels, around 3%, 4%. And that is really that is what allows us to plan. Again, that is not a bad thing for commercial banks, for the sector. Negative rates were unsustainable, risky for the system. Very high rates kill the economy. Low rates, maybe we are going to have too low growth. And that is the one thing we need to focus on. How do we manage an economy where terminal rates are a bit higher because all the structural factors, not just defense, demographics, decarbonization.
True.
So you have structural trends that are more inflationary than before, slow growth. What do we do about it?
So I know that you're in a quiet period, so you can't talk directly about the financials, but can you help me understand, how do you plan for things like net interest income when you're across so many different regions with so many different policies and so many different so-called terminal rates? How do you plan for that kind of thing? What does that look like?
Look, Santander is a global bank, but basically it's Europe of the Americas. And we have 166 million customers. First thing is diversification is key, not just for us, for anybody. And we have diversification by businesses, 5 global businesses, and by regions and countries. So that means that if something doesn't go well in one country, usually it gets compensated by another. And so what you try is to really have a context for risk appetite. Do we take more risk, less risk? We don't manage interest rates, right? Yeah. As I said, the context is really good for financial institutions, especially commercial banks like ours. Why? Because negative rates meant that with a big retail base, you're not charged, but you were being charged by the central banks for 20% of our deposits, and we couldn't charge. So positive rates, low growth, high unemployment is not a bad scenario for commercial banks.
So some other banks have pulled back from the United States. International banks, I'm thinking specifically of HSBC, BNP Paribas are still there. They still have a presence. You've been leaning in a little bit more. Could you develop that for us this morning? What are you planning in the United States? How big is your presence going to be going forward from here?
We're very excited about the opportunities in the United States. We're very confident we'll reach the 15% return on tangible equity. And we're keeping it simple. Play to our strengths. Where do we have global scale that helps us in this market? Make sure that we are leveraging our network. And so in the biggest business, which is the consumer, we have something none of the other foreign banks have or had, which is at scale auto business. We're number 5 in the US. We're number 1 in Europe. We bring our OEMs here. And second, we have scale to invest in our own technology. So we're going to deploy our own technology to launch a digital bank to make sure we can fund the auto business competitively. Simple.
Anna, this was brilliant. I know you've got a super busy morning, so we appreciate you carving out some time for us here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much.
Great to be here.
Anna Botín there, the Banco Santander chairman. Let's go over to the IMF headquarters where Lisa's standing by with a special guest. Lisa, we're going to throw it over to you.
Thank you so much, John. I am here at the IMF headquarters with Geeta Gopinath, the first deputy managing director for the IMF at a time of highly fraught geopolitical tensions, all this discussion about fragmentation. You wrote a paper that was fascinating about fragmentation, just how much of it is actually happening, the onshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, et cetera.
Yes. So, Lisa, if you look at the data and if you look at just a superficial number, which is the ratio of global trade to GDP, now that number is holding up really well, and you think everything looks fine. But if you look under the surface, you're absolutely seeing signs of fragmentation. And if you look at trade between a US-centric bloc versus a China-centric bloc, that trade has gone down by much more than trade within geopolitically aligned firms. That's also true for foreign direct investment. So we are seeing these shifts, but at the same time, we're also seeing the role of connector countries like Vietnam and Mexico that are coming in and channeling supply chains around the world. And all of this can raise the cost, ultimately, of goods for countries.
Which is really the key question here, which is how much structurally higher is inflation in this new era of fragmentation?
This is a main concern, and these are numbers that we have to determine. And now, we're still at an early stage, so we aren't looking at very dramatic movements over here. But if this process continues, it could lead to much more inflationary pressures.
Do you have a rate in mind about, is it 3% or 4%? Is that the kind of rate we can imagine in this world?
Right now, based on the scale at which it's happening, I wouldn't say it will be that large. But again, the risk is if it heads in a much more worse direction.
It seems like this is the path of travel. Everyone's talking about fragmentation. Everyone's talking about protectionist policies. In an era where so many countries seem to be rejecting free trade, what's the IMF's role?
We have a really important role to play as a multilateral institution. You know, the world is moving away from a rules-based trading system. So what needs to happen is diplomacy and pragmatic approaches. And that's what we're trying to push for through this meeting, getting countries together to work at least on areas where they can agree on. Like on services trade, there's much more progress that's happening on services trade. We need to work together on debt issues, on climate issues. That will hopefully rebuild trust and slow the process of fragmentation.
We also see an increase in geopolitical tensions, and we saw this overnight with the attacks in Iran. There were some real questions around what the price of oil would do. It did nothing, but that's as people were talking about de-escalation. Ed Yardeni yesterday was talking about the possibility of an oil shock akin to the 1970s, with oil prices going to $100 a barrel should this escalate. Do you foresee a similar type of thing happening?
This is a risk we worry about. If there is a serious escalation, which means a much more wider regional escalation than what we've seen so far, then yes, we could have a severe oil shock. But we're not there yet, and as you can see in terms of oil prices, it went up some, but it's come back down. We have supply excess capacity in Saudi Arabia. We have non-OPEC countries putting a lot more oil out on the market. So there are other sources of supply that can, buffer these shocks. But if there's a large-scale escalation in the Middle East, that is a problem.
Is that the line in the sand, $100 a barrel, and that would consist of the shock?
I think going up $100 a barrel would be problematic, but even going from here to $100 a barrel would be difficult for countries to deal with, who are still fighting the last inflation fight, which is to bring inflation back down to target.
One thing that the IMF has talked extensively about is concern about sovereign debt, in particular in the United States and the overhang there. What's the outcome of that? Is the fear of some sort of slugflation or just sort of a sluggish growth kind of picture because of the overhang? Is it higher rates and potentially a Liz Truss moment, which I've been talking about and get shocked at all the time in the U.S., but is there something like that that could potentially happen?
The U.S. is running very large deficits for a country where demand is very strong, and there is still the last mile in terms of bringing inflation down. So for all those reasons, the deficit, you can't have a deficit with 7% of GDP. It needs to be lower. And if you project out, it's going to stay at those high levels for a while. That has consequences, of course, for debt servicing in the U.S. But in a sense, the bigger problem is in terms of spillovers to the rest of the world. Because for the rest of the world, when you have so much of debt being issued by the U.S., that can crowd out the borrowing from other countries. Their cost of borrowing goes up, and their debt servicing costs go up by much more. So, I wouldn't say the U.S. has a debt sustainability problem now, but at the same time, when the U.S. is borrowing that heavily, that causes rates to be that much higher. It has implications for the rest of the world and for, corporations and households in the U.S.
How much higher? I mean, could you see rates staying here between 525 and 550 for the rest of this year, for even into next year?
That would not be our baseline. We would expect to see rates coming down. So, right now it's for getting inflation back to target. So we expect that will come down. It's going to take a little longer, but we expect that to come down. The question is whether it comes back down to what we saw in the decade after the GFC. And there, right now, that doesn't seem to be the case.
One thing that you talk about is this era of fragmentation is going to lead to a higher inflationary regime. Do you think it's appropriate for central banks to have a higher inflation target long term as sort of their goal? Say not 2%, but 2.5%, or somewhere between 2 and 3%, just because it is a different reality now.
Yeah. So firstly, that is a conversation we should not be having now. We need to ensure that inflation comes back down to 2%. Monetary policy can pin down a level of inflation. Yes, if you're going to have a lot of volatility in that inflation statistic, that could create problems because we are in a much more shock-prone world. But again, that is a conversation for later.
For later, but it might be.
Yes.
Okay. Gita Gopinath, I know, has to run. Otherwise, she will walk off the set because you have to get to a panel that you guys are hosting. It was wonderful to speak with you. Thank you so much, Gita.
Thank you so much.
John, back to you.
Lisa, great work. Thank you so much. Lisa Bravis there with the IMF First Deputy Managing Director, Gita Gopinath. Part of that conversation about fiscal sustainability, just to recap some of those headlines for you. The United States doesn't have a debt sustainability problem as of now. As of now is probably where the emphasis is right there and where it should be. The US cannot have a 7% of GDP deficit. It must come down. It's part of the problem here in Washington, D.C., and we've been having this conversation for the last couple of days. America is running a very large deficit, and that's part of the reason why we're seeing this so-called US exceptionalism. And that US exceptionalism is coming with problems for the rest of the world. You don't just get the positive spillover from economic growth, you also get much higher interest rates, and with that, a much stronger dollar. And what you've heard over the last few days is complaint after complaint about what's developing in foreign exchange. And those complaints are coming from all over the place, including Malaysia, who have had to intervene, South Korea and Japan, who are stressing that they might do the very same. And South Korea and Japan, officials from both those countries, had a meeting earlier this week with the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, and no doubt they were airing some of those concerns. Now, the big question for the IMF and the World Bank this week is whether that continues. How much longer will this go on for? The duration question is the one that's being asked in Washington, D.C., and none of us can give you an answer to it, because, AMH, the longer this goes on, the more problems that accumulate, the more stress that will build, and ultimately, words won't be enough from Japan and South Korea.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, you didn't just hear that from Gita. This was in their report. What I found interesting is they said, and don't expect this to be a quick remedy to what's going on in the fiscal policy in the United States, because also on the sidelines of the IMF, what everyone is talking about is the U.S. election. And the fact of the matter is, the United States is not going to spend less. There's not going to be tax hikes in an election year. So getting their fiscal policy under wraps to be a more healthy outlook, that's not going to happen this year, and it's definitely not going to happen in 2025, what Adam Posen said.
The conversations will continue on Monday when we're back in New York City. Just to give you a feel for the lineup on Monday morning, Dean Kernan of Macro Risk Advisors will join us, Al Salinios of RBC, JP Morgan's Bob Michael, and European Investment Bank President Nadia Calvino joining us around a table in New York. From Washington, D.C., thank you very much for being with us here at the IMF World Bank Spring Meetings. This was Bloomberg Surveillance.
From Washington to New York, to our viewers worldwide, a very good morning. I'm Manus Cranny filling in for Jonathan Farrow. The